The music box had always been there, long before she knew what it meant to miss someone, long before silence became something heavy rather than peaceful. It rested at the far edge of the old vanity, nestled between a tarnished comb and a porcelain dish that once held rings too loose for time to keep. Its lid was closed, its brass inlay faded with age, and its key was nowhere to be found. Or maybe it never had a key. Maybe it was never meant to be wound in the first place. She had stared at it often as a child, curious not because it played a tune, but because it didn't, because no matter how many times she reached for it or watched her aunt trace its curved design with absent fingers, the box never sang. And yet, everyone in the house behaved as if it did. They treated it with the reverence reserved for things that had once mattered, a quiet kind of importance, like the final page of a letter left unsigned, or a chair always kept empty. She hadn't been in this room for years, not since the funeral, not since the scent of jasmine faded from the curtains and the floorboards forgot the shape of footsteps. But this morning, without planning to, she opened the door again. The dust was still there, polite and undisturbed. The light filtered in at an angle that made everything look smaller. And on the vanity, the music box waited, untouched, uninviting, yet somehow expectant. She didn't move toward it right away. Instead, she stood in the doorway, hands still at her sides, as though waiting for the room to speak first. It didn't, but something in its silence folded around her gently, like an old shawl draped over the shoulders. She crossed the room and sat down at the vanity, just as her aunt used to. The stool let out the same soft groan beneath her weight. She looked into the mirror, but the reflection didn't quite match her memory of herself, or of this place. Her hand reached out, fingertips brushing the lid of the music box. It was colder than it should have been. And then, without effort or thought, the lid lifted. The silence that spilled out wasn't empty. It was full. So full, in fact, that it pressed against her chest like a breath withheld. No melody came, no mechanical hum or broken chime, just stillness. But it was a stillness that moved through her like water in the walls. And in that silence, she remembered everything. The silence didn't leave when she closed the lid. It lingered in the space between her ribs, in the corners of the mirror's reflection, in the shadows beneath the vanity's legs. She stayed seated, her hands resting on her lap now, as if waiting for a sound that would never come. But there was no need. The absence had already said enough. It spoke in scents and echoes, in the outline of a shawl that wasn't draped over the chair, in the flicker of light that caught a bottle of perfume long evaporated. Time had stopped here, not in the dramatic way stories described, but gently, like a breath held in sleep. She didn't cry. Not because there was no sadness, but because what she felt had softened over the years. The grief had worn down its edges, becoming something rounder, quieter, something that didn't sting but still pulsed beneath the skin. She turned her head slowly, as if afraid a sudden movement might startle whatever fragile thread held the room together. Her gaze settled on the windowsill, where a single dried sprig of lavender leaned against the glass. It hadn't been fresh in years, but it remained upright, dignified in its stillness, just like everything else in this room. She stood finally, unsure why her legs felt heavier than before. Not weak, just reluctant, as if the floor remembered every step her aunt once took and was unwilling to trade memories for footprints. She stepped softly, instinctively avoiding the third floorboard from the left, the one that used to creak just enough to wake the sleeping cat in the corner. The cat was long gone, of course, but her body remembered the way around it, as if time inside the room moved differently, or didn't move at all. At the door, she turned back. The music box was closed again. Nothing had changed. And yet, the room no longer looked untouched. It looked lived in, not because of dust disturbed or objects moved, but because something invisible had been acknowledged. A presence she hadn't dared to greet for so long had now met her halfway. It hadn't needed music. It had only needed space. She left the door open when she stepped out, not on purpose, but because her hand forgot to pull it shut. Or maybe it didn't forget. Maybe part of her understood that doors left ajar hold different meanings. An invitation, a truce, or simply a quiet promise that silence, when honored, can become something more than absence. The rest of the house greeted her with a different kind of quiet, one that didn't press against her so much as wait beside her. The hallway stretched long, its walls painted in a shade that once held warmth, but now leaned into something more muted, like light filtered through memory. She ran her hand along the banister as she descended the stairs, and the smooth wood, worn down by decades of fingers reaching for balance, felt like an old voice humming beneath her palm. At the base of the staircase, the grandfather clock stood tall and still. It hadn't ticked since the day her aunt passed, though no one had made a decision to stop it. It had simply run out of time, and was never asked to begin again. She glanced at its face, the hands frozen at a time she never bothered to remember. Not because it wasn't important, but because some moments don't need to be named to be known. The kitchen was just as she remembered. The kettle rested on the stove, the mug rack held 3 mismatched cups, and a tea bag, still sealed in its paper, sat in a small ceramic bowl, waiting for a cup that was never poured. She didn't touch anything. Instead, she stood by the window, watching the garden breathe beneath a soft gray sky. The lavender bushes had grown wild, the hydrangeas sagged with the weight of their petals, and beneath the old bench, where her aunt used to sit with a book she never finished, a patch of ivy had begun to claim the stone. It should have made her feel sad, that life continued without her, that the garden didn't mourn. But it didn't. It felt reassuring, as if the world outside had chosen not to erase but to hold, to carry traces, not of sorrow but of continuity. She returned to the hallway and paused at the foot of the stairs, her eyes flicking once more to the music box room above. She hadn't meant to go in that morning. She hadn't meant to feel what she felt, or to open what she opened. But now that she had, the house felt different. Not haunted, not heavy, just known. And that knowing came not from memory, but from presence, from having walked through something that had been waiting for her to come back and notice. Not fix, not change, just notice. She didn't go back up, not yet. She simply stood there, in the center of a quiet that no longer felt hollow, and let it fill her in a way music never could. Later that day, as the sky deepened into its quieter blue, she found herself sitting on the back steps, the ones that led down to the overgrown garden. The wood beneath her creaked softly, but didn't protest. Her shoes touched the stone path that used to be swept every Sunday, back when order felt like a kind of devotion. Now, weeds poked through the cracks with quiet defiance, and she didn't mind. Her fingers played absently with the hem of her sleeve, her thoughts drifting without direction. Something had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but like the slow turn of a tide no one noticed until the shore looked unfamiliar. The silence of the house no longer clung to her skin. It had entered her instead, gently, like breath. And in that stillness, things began to surface. Small things, scattered and soft. She remembered a morning long ago when she had found her aunt sitting silently in the parlor, the music box in her lap. There had been no sound then either. Just the hush of a rainy day and the rhythm of raindrops against the glass. Her aunt's hands had rested on the lid as if it held something fragile, not a tune, but a feeling. She hadn't spoken. She never did when she held that box. And as a child, she hadn't asked. But now, sitting in the same house all these years later, she realized that the silence between them on that day had been filled with more than she'd understood. It wasn't absence. It was memory, kept safe, not shared through words, but through the kind of presence that asked nothing, needed nothing, only space to exist. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the floorboards behind her. She turned her head slightly, listening, not for music, but for what came after music. The quiet that followed the last note, the part most people ignored. That was the part her aunt had taught her to notice, not through instructions or explanation, but through the way she lived, The box had never needed to sing. Its silence was its song. And now, after all these years, she could finally hear it. She stood slowly, brushing dust from the backs of her legs, and stepped back into the house, not to fix, not to clean, not to change anything. Just to be there. Just to stay, for a little while, in the company of what remained. That evening, as the first stars pressed gently against the darkening sky, she found herself back at the vanity. She hadn't planned to return. The day had already been filled with more memory than she usually allowed, and her heart was tender in a way that felt both soothing and unguarded. But the room had drawn her in again, not forcefully, not with grief, but with a kind of quiet understanding, the way a familiar scent drifts through a window, the way a name unspoken still finds its way to the tongue. She sat down slowly, her movements more deliberate this time, not as though sneaking into something sacred, but as though reclaiming a seat at something already hers. The box remained closed. It looked the same as it always had, humble, unimposing, easy to overlook by anyone who didn't know better. But now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. She ran her fingers gently over the brass inlay again, this time not searching for answers or music, but simply acknowledging its presence. It had waited so long without asking. It had kept something safe. Not a song, not even a secret, but a kind of stillness that only made sense once you stopped trying to understand it. She didn't open it again. She didn't need to. The opening had already happened, somewhere else, somewhere deeper than wood and hinges, somewhere between memory and breath. She reached for the small mirror propped beside the box and angled it slightly, catching her reflection in the dusky light. There, layered behind her own face, she saw echoes, the way her aunt used to sit, spine tall, eyes far away. The curve of a shoulder turned slightly inward, the softness of someone who had learned to carry things without showing their weight. She didn't feel haunted. She felt held, not by the object, but by the silence it had kept alive, a silence that wasn't void, but invitation. She stood once more, this time slower, and left the room just as gently. The music box didn't call her back. It didn't need to. Its purpose had never been to summon, only to remain, until someone remembered how to listen without needing sound. The days that followed unfolded like pages she hadn't realized were still part of the story. She stayed in the house longer than intended, each morning rising with no particular task, but still drawn to the rooms like threads woven through habit and memory. She found herself tracing the edges of furniture, pausing in doorways, listening not for sounds, but for the quiet shapes memory made in the air. The music box remained untouched. She hadn't opened it again, not because she feared it, but because she didn't need to. Its silence had already reached her. It no longer waited for her presence. It accompanied her, like the faint scent of old pages or the warmth left on a chair after someone has just stood up. Invisible, but never absent. She began to notice the house differently, not as something decaying, but as something resting. The dust wasn't neglect, but softness. The creaks in the floor weren't complaints, but sighs. Even the cobwebs in the corners caught the light in a way that resembled lace rather than abandonment. She found a sweater in the hall closet that still held her aunt's shape and draped it over her shoulders without ceremony. It was too warm for the season, but she wore it anyway. It didn't comfort her. It didn't even fit quite right, but it made space for something familiar to sit close, like walking through a room filled with someone's handwriting, words not read aloud but still understood. She didn't speak to the house. She didn't need to. It wasn't the kind of place that required words. It had lived too long in quiet for conversation to feel natural. Instead, she moved as her aunt once had, without rush, without explanation. In the evenings, she sat by the same window her aunt had favored. The garden below was no longer just overgrown. It was a landscape of persistence. Each plant that had survived without pruning, each flower that bloomed without permission, seemed to mirror the quiet resilience of the house itself. Nothing here begged to be saved. Nothing asked to be restored. And yet, everything remained, tender, watchful, patient. She wondered how long the music box had held that kind of silence, how many years it had waited without pushing. It made her think of other things that had gone unopened, letters in drawers, feelings left unspoken, moments brushed aside because life moved too quickly to pause and feel them fully. But here, now, the pause was all there was, and in that space she began to feel something she hadn't known she was missing, a sense of being allowed to stay, allowed to feel, allowed to be exactly as she was, with nothing asked in return. One afternoon, as the wind outside rustled through the ivy in a rhythm almost like breath, she opened the drawer beneath the vanity for the first time in years. It stuck slightly, as if the wood had swollen from time and waiting, but eventually gave way with a soft shudder. Inside, she found objects that had no need to explain themselves. A hair ribbon frayed at the ends, a faded photograph of two women laughing on a beach she didn't recognize, and a folded handkerchief with a single embroidered letter in the corner. Everything inside felt as though it had been placed there not for safekeeping, but for remembering. Not memories stored to be preserved, but to be quietly rediscovered. Her fingers moved slowly, not from hesitation, but reverence. Each item, though simple, held the weight of a pause, the kind that happens just before a thought forms, or right after a long silence says enough. She didn't take anything out. Instead, she sat there with the drawer open, letting her eyes rest on what remained. The photograph especially held her gaze. She didn't know the name of the other woman, but something in the way they leaned toward each other, shoulders touching, mouths mid-laughter, spoke of closeness that had no need for labels. It reminded her of a time in her own life when someone had once reached for her hand without needing a reason, a time she had buried beneath years of movement and noise. That memory rose now, slow and unthreatening, like something that had been waiting patiently in the wings. The house, it seemed, had a way of letting things return, not to haunt, but to soften. She closed the drawer gently, careful not to disturb the placement of anything. The act of returning it to its place felt like a promise, one that said nothing needed to be solved or fixed, just seen, just felt. The floor creaked as she stood, and for a moment she could almost believe her aunt had passed by the doorway, not as a ghost, not as a chill in the air, but as a trace, like perfume that lingers long after someone's left the room. She didn't turn to look. Some presences are better honored without being chased. She simply placed her hand on the edge of the vanity, feeling the grain of the wood under her palm, and nodded, not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to the room itself, as if to say, "I'm listening now. I hear what was never said." That night, she lit a candle instead of turning on the light. The bulb in the ceiling fixture had long since burned out, but she hadn't felt the need to replace it. The soft glow of flame suited the room better, casting gentle shadows that moved with breath and memory. The walls no longer felt still. They pulsed slightly, as if remembering the warmth of stories once told in low voices. She sat in the armchair by the window, wrapped in the same worn sweater, a mug of untouched tea cooling in her hands. Outside, the wind had quieted, and the garden lay in a hush that mirrored her own. There was a calm in not doing, in letting things be. She had never understood it before. She had spent so much of her life moving, proving, adjusting. But now, here, within the soft silence of a home that asked for nothing, she was beginning to grasp the beauty of unspoken truths. She found herself thinking of her aunt, not in the way she used to, as a figure wrapped in nostalgia, but as a woman with thoughts that had rarely been voiced aloud. What did she feel when she held the music box? What echoes lived inside her that no one had ever heard? The thought didn't ache as it might have before. It didn't come with the sting of missed opportunity. Instead, it settled like a blanket, warm, a little heavy, but comforting. She realized then that some stories don't need telling to be shared. They pass through gestures, through silences carefully held. Her aunt had never explained the music box, never told her its origin or why it never played. And now she understood that perhaps that was the point. It had never been broken. It had always been whole, in its own way, complete in its silence, in what it allowed rather than expressed. The candle burned low as the night deepened, casting a flickering arc of light across the vanity's mirror. In it, her reflection shimmered, layered over memories not entirely her own. She sat still, not waiting for anything, not bracing for any revelation. Just present. There was a softness to that kind of being. No striving, no performance, just breath, body, memory, and the faint sense that silence, when embraced, becomes something more than a void. It becomes a vessel, a place where all the music that was never played, all the words that were never said, could live without unraveling. And so she stayed there, candlelight dancing gently against the walls, letting the quiet hold her the way music never quite could. The next morning arrived with a kind of hush that wasn't tied to weather but to mood. The clouds outside were soft and unhurried, and the light that filtered through the windows felt less like sunlight and more like breath. She moved slowly through the house, not out of tiredness, but from a desire not to break the spell that had settled over the place. Her steps were careful, her hands thoughtful in their touch. She reached for nothing in particular, yet paused often, at the corner of a bookshelf, at a doorway slightly ajar, at a forgotten trinket on a mantel. These small encounters didn't stir nostalgia. They invited stillness, the kind of stillness that doesn't freeze but wraps around you like water just warm enough to hold. She found herself in the back room, the one that had always been more storage than space. Boxes of fabric, a sewing machine that hadn't been threaded in decades, and shelves of books too faded to read. And on a small table, almost hidden by an old curtain draped carelessly over a chair, was another box. Not like the music box, not carved or ornate, but simpler, almost plain. Still, something about it felt familiar. She lifted it gently, wiping a layer of dust from its lid with the sleeve of her sweater. Inside she found notes, handwritten on paper yellowed with time, folded in uneven halves. They weren't letters in the traditional sense. No salutations, no closings. Just fragments, thoughts, observations, lines written in a looping script that matched the one she had seen in recipe books and birthday cards throughout her childhood. Her aunt's handwriting, still alive on the page. She didn't read them all. Not yet. She took one and sat by the window, unfolding it slowly. The words inside weren't profound. They spoke of the morning light on a Wednesday, the sound of rain on the kitchen roof, the way the steam curled from a cup of tea that had been forgotten for too long. But each line was a kind of music, quiet, ordinary, beautiful in its restraint. They weren't meant to be shared. They were notes for no one, or perhaps for the silence itself. And in reading them, she understood something deeper about the music box, about the house, about the woman who had lived inside both. Some people leave behind stories told in grand arcs. Others leave behind rooms that still breathe when you sit still long enough. And she had found a symphony written in stillness, in boxes tucked away, in spaces no one had rushed to fill. That evening, with the quiet now something she welcomed rather than filled, she gathered the notes into a small bundle and placed them gently back inside the plain box. She didn't tie it shut. She didn't tuck it away. Instead, she left it on the corner of the table just within sight, as if to say, "You may continue." The house didn't hum in response, but something shifted in the air, a subtle warmth, like the trace of a hand having just lifted from a shoulder. She didn't need confirmation. The understanding she carried now had no need for signs or affirmations. It was the kind of knowing that lived deeper than explanation, that settled not in the mind but somewhere between skin and spirit. She moved through the rest of the house with ease, pausing not out of uncertainty but reverence. As night fell, she returned once more to the vanity. The music box remained exactly where it had always been, unchanged, silent, content. She didn't open it this time either. She didn't need to. Its silence had already done the work it was meant to do, not to reveal, but to receive, not to speak, but to hold space. She rested her fingers atop it briefly, not as a gesture of possession, but of gratitude. There was no music to accompany the moment, no swell of emotion, no climactic realization, only breath and the presence of something gentle. It had never been about unlocking secrets. It had always been about being still long enough to hear what didn't need to be said. And now, she understood. The music had never been sound. It had always been permission. She stood slowly, stretching the quiet into every limb, and turned out the light. She didn't need the candle tonight. The darkness in the room wasn't absence. It was fullness. She walked past the open door, past the frame where her aunt once stood with a book half read and a smile half formed, and descended the stairs one last time for the day. Nothing had changed in any visible way, but everything felt different, not new, not mended, simply softened. The kind of soft that comes after years of waiting, when the silence finally trusts you enough to let you in. And as she passed the grandfather clock that no longer ticked, she reached out and touched its side, not to wind it, not to wake it, but to greet it, as one stillness greets another, quietly, fully, without asking for sound. It had been a week since she arrived, though time inside the house refused to measure itself by days. There was no calendar on the wall, no ticking clock to mark progress. Mornings bled softly into evenings, and sleep came not with exhaustion but with quiet surrender. She no longer felt like a guest. She no longer felt like someone retracing someone else's footsteps. Instead, she moved through the rooms as though the walls had already accepted her return, as though they'd been waiting, not for someone new, but for someone who remembered how to move without rushing. The house did not demand attention, yet it rewarded presence. Small details revealed themselves: creases in old pillowcases, corners of photographs curling inward from years of breath and sun, a faint scent in the hallway that seemed to bloom only when she exhaled. She began to notice echoes, not of voices, but of gestures. The way her hand rested on a doorknob mirrored how her aunt's once did. The way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, or folded a blanket at the end of a chair, felt like inherited choreography. These weren't conscious imitations. They arose from stillness, from the body remembering without being taught. One afternoon, as she ran her hand across the kitchen counter, she stopped suddenly, not because she saw anything remarkable, but because she felt something. A warmth beneath her palm, subtle but real, as if a memory had just passed through. She didn't question it. Some things aren't meant to be named. They are only meant to be held for a moment, then allowed to pass. Later, she stood at the threshold of the attic stairs. She hadn't gone up there yet, not out of fear, but out of patience. Some spaces don't open until they're ready. And now, the door was slightly ajar, not pushed by hand or breeze, but by time itself. She climbed slowly, each step creaking like an old voice clearing its throat. The air changed as she ascended, not colder, not mustier, just older, like walking into a thought that had waited too long to be finished. The attic was dim, lit only by the amber spill of light from a small round window. Dust floated in shafts like suspended breath. Boxes lined the edges of the room, untouched but not forgotten. She didn't open any of them. She simply stood in the middle of the space, listening, not with her ears, but with her presence. And the silence that met her wasn't empty. It was layered, soft, full of things that had waited, not to be revealed, but to be witnessed. She returned to the attic the next morning, this time with a quiet sense of purpose. Not to uncover anything, but to sit. There was an old rocking chair beneath the window, draped in a faded quilt that had lost its color but not its warmth. She settled into it, letting the frame adjust to her weight with a slow wooden sigh. Outside, the light moved across the trees like a careful brushstroke, painting the room in shifting shadows. She rested her hands on her lap, unclenched, and felt herself soften with the chair's gentle rhythm. It didn't rock on its own. It waited for her movement, responded with balance. It reminded her of how her aunt used to listen, without interruption, without advice. just presence, just space. Around her, the boxes remained unopened. They weren't asking for anything. Some were tied with ribbon, others sealed with yellowing tape. Some barely closed at all. They looked like stories not needing to be read aloud, only acknowledged. She turned her head slowly, eyes drifting across their shapes, letting them speak in silence. One was marked with a faded label, Winters, but the rest held no names, no clues. That didn't matter. The attic itself felt like memory, not the sharp kind that cuts or surprises, but the kind that lingers in the corners of a room long after everyone's left. She didn't search. She didn't organize. She simply stayed, breathing in a space that had learned how to hold stillness like a language. The hours passed without her noticing. There was no clock, no schedule pulling her back. And yet, when she finally rose, she did so without reluctance. She touched one of the boxes lightly as she passed, not to open it, but to thank it, for waiting, for remaining, for not demanding to be seen in any other way than it already was. As she descended the attic stairs, the house seemed to lean into her movement, embracing her in its steady hush. And when she reached the second-floor landing, she paused, not because something called her, but because something inside her answered. A quiet agreement between presence and place, a mutual understanding that not all silence is absence. Some silence is invitation, some is return. That evening, as the sky folded itself into a deeper blue, she returned to the vanity once more. The air in the room held a quiet familiarity, not just from days passed in stillness, but from something older, something lived in. She noticed how the fabric of the curtains seemed thinner now, almost translucent, as if memory itself had worn them down. The chair creaked as she sat, but not in protest. It sounded more like recognition. The music box sat where it always had, untouched since the first morning she opened it. She hadn't planned to reach for it again, and yet her fingers moved with a quiet inevitability, as if responding to a rhythm outside of time. She didn't lift the lid. She only placed her palm on top of it lightly and closed her eyes. And closed. What rose inside her wasn't a song. It was something softer, a breath, a shape without sound. And in that silence, she remembered more than events. She remembered feelings. The warmth of her aunt's hand resting briefly on her shoulder after a long day. The rustle of pages from a book read aloud but never finished. The comfort of being in the same room with someone who didn't ask for anything. These memories had no beginning, no end. They moved through her like water, like air, asking only to be noticed. And she noticed them, fully, without resistance, without the need to hold them in place. It wasn't grief, it wasn't joy, it was simply presence, deep, resonant, and unmeasured. She opened her eyes slowly, unsure how long she had been sitting there. The light had changed. The edges of the room now shimmered in that brief golden moment before night arrives fully. She removed her hand from the box and rose, her limbs unhurried, her breath steady. Nothing had changed in the room, and yet everything felt different. Not newer, not healed, just more deeply known, as though the silence itself had spoken, not with answers, but with acceptance. She turned toward the doorway, pausing for one last glance over her shoulder. The music box didn't call to her. It didn't need to. In its quiet, it had already said everything that needed saying. The next morning, the rain arrived without warning, soft at first, then steady, tracing quiet rivers down the window panes. She welcomed it. The rhythm of rain against glass brought a different kind of silence, one that moved. It filled the house like breath fills lungs, not with urgency, but with purpose. She wrapped herself in the same sweater and wandered the hallways without aim, her bare feet brushing gently against the cool wooden floor. The house felt more alive in the rain, not louder, but more articulate. Every creak, every drip, every shift in light spoke a language she was beginning to understand. Not everything needed words. Some truths arrived through echo, through pause, through the gentle persistence of weather. She found herself standing in the doorway of her aunt's bedroom. She hadn't stepped inside since the funeral, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty, unsure if memory would embrace or undo her. But the rain had softened something, and so she crossed the threshold, slowly, reverently. The room remained exactly as she remembered, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, a pair of slippers tucked beneath the chair, a small collection of books on the nightstand, their spines worn, their pages slightly yellowed. She didn't sit. She only walked to the window and placed her hand against the glass, watching the garden blur beneath the rain. It didn't feel like she had entered the past. It felt like the past had made space for her in the present. On the dresser there was another small box. Not a music box this time. Something simpler, wooden, its surface smooth from years of touch. She opened it gently. Inside were photographs. Black and white, some color, faces she half recognized. A few of her younger self, caught mid-laughter or mid-thought, taken from angles that suggested love rather than posing. Beneath the stack, a note, brief, written in her aunt's unmistakable handwriting. Keep what speaks to you. Let the rest stay quiet. She didn't cry. She smiled, not with her lips but with her chest. A soft swell of warmth that didn't need release. She closed the box, placed it back exactly where she found it, and stepped away. Not with reluctance, but with calm. The room had given her something, and she had received it. That was enough. That night, the rain continued, steady and insistent, as though the sky had found something worth releasing. She lay on the old couch in the sitting room, covered by a thin blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar. The windows hummed with the wind, but the house remained unshaken. Its silence deepened rather than disturbed. She stared at the ceiling, watching shadows shift as the candlelight flickered. There were no plans for the next day, no reason to mark time. The house had become less a place to pass through and more a space to listen. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was only being, and that, somehow, was everything. Somewhere between waking and sleep, she thought again of the music box. Not as an object, but as a presence. A keeper of something wordless. She had once believed silence needed to be filled, solved, or escaped. But now she understood that some silences are complete in themselves, like a night sky that doesn't need stars to be whole. The box had never been about music. It had always been about space. The space to hold what didn't need saying. The space to carry what had no melody, only meaning. And in that space, she had finally begun to hear herself. Not her thoughts or worries, but the quiet pulse of something older. Something that existed before explanation. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm of rain and memory settle into her bones. The house didn't disappear behind her eyelids. It became clearer. Every room, every corner, every item kept in place not out of habit, but out of trust. The silence between walls wasn't hollow, it was sacred. And in that sacredness, she no longer felt alone. The music box hadn't sung, but it had spoken. In stillness, in restraint, in patience. And now, as she drifted into sleep beneath a ceiling that remembered everything, she knew she would carry that silence with her, into dreams, into days to come, into every room she would ever enter after this one, not as an absence, but as a presence too full for sound. The next morning arrived with a stillness even the rain didn't dare disturb. The sky remained overcast, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a damp hush that softened every surface. She woke without effort, as if her body had followed a rhythm that didn't need alarms. Her feet touched the floor gently. Her hands found the edge of the window frame without searching. Outside, the garden glistened, leaves heavy with last night's memory, petals bowed in quiet resilience. She stood there for a long while, watching nothing in particular, simply letting her breath match the tempo of the world beyond the glass. There was a strange beauty in the after rain, when everything held still, not from fear or weariness, but from reverence, as if the earth, too, had remembered something worth pausing for. She made tea without thought, her hands moving through the kitchen as though they had always belonged to this house. She didn't measure anything. She didn't time the steep. Everything was by feel now, guided more by texture and silence than instruction. The mug was chipped along the handle, but she chose it anyway. It was the one her aunt had used most often, the one that fit perfectly in the palm, like a stone warmed by the sun. She sat by the window in the dining room, not to eat, not to work, but simply to be near the light. The chair beneath her didn't creak this time. It held her without question. The table still bore the faint rings of cups long since washed, the ghost of past mornings layered beneath the present one. She ran her finger along one of them, not to clean it, but to feel the shape of continuity. The music box remained upstairs, untouched. Yet somehow its presence followed her, not like a shadow, but like a thread, subtle, invisible, quietly strong. It didn't pull. It didn't weigh. It connected. And though she hadn't opened it again, she felt as though she carried it now, not the object itself, but what it taught her, the art of pausing, the grace of holding space, the strength in quiet. She took a sip of her tea, now lukewarm, and didn't mind. Some things weren't meant to be rushed. Some warmth stayed even after the heat had gone. The house agreed. Its walls didn't press in or fall away. They simply stood, the way trees do, letting wind pass through their branches without needing to chase it. Later that day, she wandered into the hallway where the framed photographs lined the wall, each one slightly askew in its own particular way. She had passed them many times before without truly looking, as one does when familiarity dims perception. But today, something shifted. She stopped in front of a small, square frame near the end of the row. It held a picture she didn't remember seeing before. Two figures sitting on the porch steps, not smiling for the camera, just sitting. One was clearly her aunt, the other a woman whose name she didn't know, but whose presence in the image felt unmistakably gentle. They weren't posing. They weren't performing. They were simply sharing space, the way silence is sometimes shared between people who have grown past the need for conversation. She studied their posture, the way their knees leaned slightly inward, the way their arms rested easily on their legs, fingers loose, shoulders low. It was the language of comfort, of understanding, of long companionship. She reached out and touched the glass lightly, not to connect with the photograph, but to acknowledge it. The hallway around her seemed to breathe in response, the air shifting ever so slightly as if dusting off a memory too polite to announce itself. She wondered how many such moments lived quietly in the walls, not hidden, but held, not forgotten, but folded gently out of view. This house was full of them. Not grand stories, but small mercies, soft memories left where they could be found, but never forced. She continued down the hallway slowly, each step its own quiet intention. She ran her hand along the wood paneling, felt the grooves where age had deepened the grain. At the end of the hall, she paused before turning. There was nothing urgent waiting, no task to return to. And yet her chest felt full, swollen not with emotion but with awareness, as though she had become part of the house's memory rather than just a visitor passing through it. She looked back once more at the photographs, their frames catching the light just enough to shimmer faintly. It was a gallery of stillness, of relationships that didn't need to be explained to be understood. And in that moment, she felt not alone, but accompanied, by silence, by time, by every gesture that had ever lingered just long enough to be remembered. That afternoon, she opened the back door and stepped into the garden for the first time since arriving. The earth was still damp beneath her feet, the scent of wet leaves and moss rising gently with each step. Ivy clung to the bricks of the outer wall, tracing their way upward as if remembering the path of old hands that had once planted them. The garden had grown wild in the way places do when left alone, not unruly, but free. Plants leaned into each other without hierarchy. Blooms appeared where no seeds had been sown for years, and a narrow path of stone, half swallowed by grass, curved softly through it all. She didn't try to clear it. She didn't try to restore it. She only walked it as it was, letting her fingers brush over leaves and petals as though greeting neighbors she hadn't seen in a long time. At the far end of the garden stood a bench, weathered and dappled with lichen. She sat, the wood slightly damp, but she didn't mind. The sky had begun to clear, and filtered sunlight passed through the branches above, casting soft, shifting patterns across her lap. She closed her eyes and listened, not to birdsong or breeze, but to the feeling of being among things that grew without explanation. There was no performance in this garden, no need for symmetry or praise. It existed for its own sake, for the quiet companionship of time. She breathed deeply, and for the first time, it felt as though the silence inside her matched the silence around her, not as a void, but as a rhythm, a slow, living rhythm that asked nothing but to be noticed. She opened her eyes and traced the shape of the house beyond the trees. From this angle, it looked smaller, more intimate, less like a structure and more like a memory made solid. The windows reflected the sky in fragments, catching light as though holding it carefully. She imagined her aunt sitting here once, tea in hand, book closed on her lap, not reading but simply being, watching the seasons change without asking them to hurry. She understood now why the house had felt so different from the world she had left behind. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about presence, about being in a space where nothing rushed to become anything else, where a day could pass without demand and still feel full, where silence wasn't a pause between events, but the event itself. She returned to the house as dusk settled gently over the garden, casting long, slow shadows across the floorboards. Her footsteps felt quieter now, not because she tried to be silent, but because silence had begun to walk with her, like an old friend whose presence no longer needed announcement. The rooms welcomed her without changing. Nothing had moved, nothing had shifted in any visible way, and yet everything felt newly familiar. She walked through the kitchen, touching the edge of the table, then the rim of the sink, and paused for a moment beside the stove, where a forgotten cast-iron kettle still sat, blackened slightly with time. She didn't move it. She only acknowledged it. There was peace in letting things stay where they had been loved last. She found herself drawn to the small sitting room by the front of the house, the one her aunt had rarely used when guests weren't present. It had always felt a bit too formal, too polished. But now, in the fading light, it seemed softer somehow. The fabric on the furniture had worn gently. The books on the shelf leaned into one another like people do when waiting in quiet conversation. She sat in a chair by the window, not the grand one with the carved arms, but the smaller one beside it, the one that looked slightly out of place, as if it had been brought in for someone who never quite arrived. She sank into it slowly, and the cushion, though thin, held her as though it remembered how. Outside, the lamplight flickered on at the edge of the street, catching the glass in a warm amber glow. She watched as the last of the day melted into evening, the color of the sky shifting like breath exhaled through memory. She didn't reach for anything to read. She didn't speak. She only sat, letting the silence stretch long and loose around her shoulders. It felt like a pause without expectation, a stillness that made room for breath rather than trying to hold it in. And in that quiet, she realized that the music box upstairs had never needed to sing. It had only needed someone to stay long enough to hear what existed in the spaces between sound. Someone to learn that silence, when tended to gently, plays its own kind of melody. That night, before sleep, she returned once more to the room where the music box waited. The house was hushed, even more so than usual, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. She didn't bring a candle. She didn't turn on a light. The glow from the hallway was enough to draw soft outlines across the room, and her feet, bare and quiet, found the same familiar path across the floor. She sat at the vanity, her reflection in the mirror only a suggestion in the dimness. The box sat just as it had always sat, still, closed, and complete. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. The silence it had once guarded now lived within her. It had rooted itself not as something separate, but as something shared. The box no longer felt like a vessel. It felt like a mirror, reflecting not sound, but stillness she had learned to carry. She stayed there for a long while, breathing in the presence of the room. Her eyes adjusted to the dark, and she began to notice how much could be seen without light, how shadow revealed shape just as surely as brightness did. The curve of the vanity, the faint glint of metal at the base of the mirror, the soft slope of the music box's lid. These were not details to be captured. They were to be known through quiet, through nearness. She rested her hands on her lap, her posture relaxed, her shoulders no longer braced against the past. And in the silence, something like gratitude rose. Not loud, not even clear, but unmistakable. It hummed low in her chest, like a song remembered not by melody, but by feeling. When she finally stood, she didn't look back. Not out of indifference, but trust. The room would remain. The music box would remain. The silence would remain. Not frozen, but living. A part of the house. A part of her. She stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her without a sound, the latch clicking softly into place. And as she walked toward her own room, the floor creaked in familiar tones beneath her, not as warning, but as welcome. The night wrapped around the house like a final note held just long enough to fade, and in that fading, she understood what had never needed to be said. Some melodies are too whole for sound. Some truths are too generous to speak. And some silences, when truly heard, change the shape of everything that comes after. She began waking earlier, not from restlessness, but from a kind of quiet eagerness her body seemed to know before her thoughts did. The sun had not yet fully risen when she stepped into the kitchen, the sky a pale gray, just beginning to soften into color. The house, still cloaked in the hush of night's ending, felt suspended, caught between dreaming and waking. She filled the kettle, the sound of water echoing gently in the silence, and set it on the stove without turning on any lights. The warmth of the burner beneath the kettle slowly spread through the room, not in a rush, but in quiet patience. She sat by the window, hands curled around the cool ceramic of her mug, watching as the morning revealed itself in layers, the garden outside blinking open like a sleepy eye. She had stopped checking the time. There was no need. Time here moved by light, by scent, by the stretch of shadow on the floor. She no longer thought of her stay as a pause from life elsewhere. This was not an interruption. It was a return. Not to something she had left, but to something that had always known her, even when she'd forgotten how to know it back. The rooms breathed differently now, or perhaps she was the one who had learned how to breathe in rhythm with them. There was a steadiness to the days, not in routine, but in presence. Each movement, whether folding a blanket, rinsing a dish, or touching the edge of a worn book, felt like part of a quiet ceremony. Nothing extravagant, nothing important, and yet everything felt full, She wandered into the room where the piano stood, half covered by a yellowing cloth. It hadn't been played in years. A single key had long since broken, and the others were stubborn in tone, but she didn't lift the lid. She only ran her hand across the top of the instrument, letting her palm trace the dust like reading braille left behind by time. There had been music in this house once, surely, not the kind that lingered in recordings or photographs, but the kind that stayed in corners, in wood grain, in the vibration of old glass when the floor creaked just right. She closed her eyes and listened. There it was. Not a song, but a remembering. The kind of sound you can't name, but know has always been part of the silence. Later that day, while dusting the shelves in the narrow hallway near the back of the house, she found a book she didn't recognize. Its spine was unmarked, the cover plain linen, slightly warped by time and humidity. It wasn't hidden, just forgotten, wedged between cookbooks and gardening manuals that had belonged to her aunt. She pulled it free gently, mindful of its fragile stitching, and opened to a random page. The handwriting inside wasn't her aunt's. It was older, looped in a way that suggested an earlier time, but the words were not grand. They were observations, quiet and precise, notes about the weather, thoughts on the shade of light before rain, a recipe for jam written in the middle of a paragraph about grief. It wasn't a journal, not exactly. It was a collection of small, unguarded moments, none asking to be remembered, but none willing to be erased. She carried the book to the sitting room and settled into the chair that now creaked less when she lowered herself into it. The room filled with soft light, and she read slowly, not seeking meaning, but letting each word unfold like a leaf. The entries weren't dated. They weren't even finished. Some ended mid-sentence. Others trailed off into blankness. But every page held something she recognized, not as a memory, but as a feeling. A quiet that felt familiar. A pause that echoed her own breath. She turned a page and found pressed flowers, dry and brittle, their colors faded into ghosts of what they once were. Lavender, a sprig of thyme, something pink she couldn't name. She touched the edge of a petal and smiled. Not because it was beautiful, but because it had been kept. She didn't read the whole book. She closed it gently and placed it on the table beside her, letting it rest like a hand left open between friends. There was a comfort in its incompleteness. It reminded her that things don't need to be finished to be whole, that some stories are not meant to be concluded, but to be returned to, slowly, as needed. She sat back and let the room hold her, the book beside her like a quiet companion. And in that moment, surrounded by objects that asked for nothing but presence, she felt again what the music box had taught her. Some silences are not waiting to be broken. They are waiting to be joined. As the afternoon light thinned into something more golden, she wandered through the hallway and stopped at the front door. It had rained again earlier, brief and soft, just enough to leave the world damp and quiet. She opened the door, not to leave, but to feel the weight of the air. The porch steps were still drying, the wood darker from moisture, and the scent of earth and green things rose around her like a memory you can't quite place. She stepped outside slowly, one foot then the other, the threshold beneath her like a pause between thoughts. She sat on the top step, arms resting loosely on her knees, and looked at the path that led away from the house, not with longing, but with calm. There was nothing pulling her outward. The world would wait. She let her eyes wander. The trees swayed slightly in a breeze too faint to hear. A single bird called from somewhere far off, not a song, but a note. Short. Certain. She remembered days long ago when she would sit in this same spot, legs too short to touch the ground, swinging her feet back and forth while her aunt sipped tea and said nothing at all. Those moments had once felt empty to her, like missed opportunities for story or advice. But now, as she sat in the same silence, she understood what had truly been shared. Not words, not guidance, but time. Quiet, undivided time. The kind of gift that isn't recognized until it's been remembered into meaning. She leaned back slightly, letting her shoulder touch the doorframe, her head tilted just enough to rest. The wood behind her was warm where the sun had touched it. The house breathed around her, steady and unhurried. She didn't think about the past or the future. She didn't wonder how long she would stay or what would come next. Those questions had lost their shape. She only existed, fully and gently, in that hour, in that porch, in that stillness. And as she listened to the world carry on without urgency, she felt the same quiet hum that had filled the music box that first morning. An invisible sound that asked for no listener, only presence. It was not something she had sought. It was something that had found her. That evening she lit a candle not out of necessity, but out of rhythm. The flicker of flame had become part of the house's heartbeat, a soft pulse of light that moved with the shadows rather than against them. She placed the candle on the kitchen counter and let it warm the room with its subtle glow. The kettle sang quietly in the background, not with insistence but with familiarity. She poured the water over a tea bag, the scent of chamomile rising like a gentle memory. She stood by the sink, cradling the mug in both hands, and watched the way the light danced on the tiles. There was nothing remarkable in the moment, and yet it held more than most. A fullness born not from what was happening, but from how little needed to happen. She carried the mug to the dining table and sat, without rearranging a thing. The table still bore the small signs of life: an old ring from a forgotten cup, a scratch along the edge, a fleck of wax from a candle burned months or years ago. She traced them absent-mindedly with her fingertip, not to clean, but to remember through touch. The house had layers, not dust, but time, not clutter, but presence. She sipped her tea and let the warmth settle into her chest. Across the room, the windows caught the reflection of the candle, duplicating its flame into a dozen quiet echoes. She thought of her aunt, of the boxes she had never opened, the notebooks she had never read, and she felt no urgency to know more. Sometimes, what's left behind isn't a mystery to be solved, but a silence to be trusted. She stayed at the table long after the tea had cooled, hands still curled around the cup as if holding a conversation without words. Outside, the trees moved gently, their leaves rustling like pages turned slowly. She closed her eyes and listened, not for meaning, but for mood. The kind of quiet that holds shape, that gives permission, that says, "This is enough." And in that moment, surrounded by the hush of wood and flame and memory, she felt something settle inside her. Not like an answer, but like a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Not everything has to be spoken. Not every door must be opened. Some rooms are meant to remain intact, not because they are sacred, but because they already speak, in silence, all that needs to be known. That night, as she lay in bed beneath the same quilt her aunt had once folded each morning, she listened to the quiet in a way that felt deliberate. It was not empty, this quiet. It was textured, layered. There was the soft creak of wood adjusting to the cool air, the occasional sigh of wind brushing against the window, and the distant, nearly imperceptible hum of the old pipes resting deep beneath the floor. These sounds didn't intrude. They accompanied. They belonged to the house as much as the walls and windows did, and over time, they had become part of its voice. She turned slightly, pulling the blanket up over her shoulder, and let her breath fall into rhythm with that voice. Each exhale a kind of reply, each inhale a listening. She thought briefly of the music box upstairs, not with longing, but with gratitude. It had never played, never moved, never demanded attention, and yet in its quiet, it had given her something she hadn't known she needed: a different way to hear, a way of listening that didn't begin with sound, but with stillness. She hadn't touched it in days, and somehow that felt right, as if the opening of it once had been enough, as if silence, when truly shared, does not need repetition to be understood. Her eyes closed slowly, not from exhaustion, but from rest, from trust, the kind of peace that doesn't erase what came before, but lets it rest beside you without weight. Just before sleep took her, she whispered, not aloud, but inside herself, a quiet thank you. Not to any one thing, not even to her aunt, but to the space that had held her, the air, the walls, the quiet gestures that had made room for her to unfold without explanation. It was the kind of gratitude that didn't rise like a song, but settled like a stone in still water, gentle, lasting, unseen from the surface. And as sleep gathered around her like a soft cloak, the silence deepened, not as a closing but as a continuation, a music that played in stillness. And she at last had learned how to listen. She awoke to sunlight filtering through the curtains, the kind of light that doesn't announce the morning but arrives like a memory, soft, familiar, already known. The house was warm, not in temperature, but in presence. It felt closer somehow, like a deep breath taken after a long silence. She sat up slowly, her body still wrapped in the gentleness of sleep, and looked around the room as if seeing it not for the first time, but with new eyes. The blanket she had pulled over herself in the night had slipped to her waist, and her hand found it instinctively, not to adjust it, but to acknowledge it. A small, quiet act of being. Nothing rushed her, not even time, especially not time. She moved through the house with an ease that surprised her. Her hands no longer hovered with hesitation. Her footsteps made no effort to soften themselves. She was no longer a visitor in this place, nor a caretaker. She had become part of it. The house accepted her movements as its own. Each drawer opened, each cup lifted, each chair drawn back at the table. She prepared breakfast without thinking. Bread toasted until golden, butter spread slowly, the knife clicking softly against the edge of the plate. She sat by the window and ate with both hands resting lightly on either side of the dish, her gaze drifting beyond the garden to where the trees stood as they always had, unmoved and yet full of movement. The wind played through the leaves without needing to bend them. When she finished, she remained seated, letting the moment breathe before standing. There was no list, no task to complete, only a quiet intuition that rose gently inside her, guiding her back upstairs. She didn't hesitate. Her hand found the banister, its curve now familiar beneath her fingers, and she climbed one step at a time, letting the rhythm of her body meet the rhythm of the house. At the top, she turned toward the bedroom, not the attic, not the guest room. The room, the one with the vanity, with the chair that creaked, with the music box that waited, though no longer as an object of mystery. Now it simply existed, a part of the quiet landscape she had come to inhabit. She entered the room and sat once more at the vanity, her reflection meeting her not with surprise but with understanding. And there, in the silence she now called home, she reached forward and opened the lid. The lid lifted without resistance, as if it too had been waiting, not impatiently, but faithfully. Inside, the box looked unchanged, no hidden compartment, no forgotten key, just the same smooth wood, the same quiet interior, untouched by time yet somehow full of it. She didn't expect music. She knew now that silence was its song. But something inside her stirred, not surprise, not sorrow, but a kind of recognition. As if by opening it this time, she had completed a conversation that had begun long before she ever knew how to listen. Her fingers hovered just above the inner edge of the box. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. What she felt came not from the object, but from what it allowed. The room was still, not frozen, alive in its stillness. Dust hung in the shafts of sunlight like notes suspended in air, and the mirror before her caught a glimmer, not of movement, but of presence. It wasn't a reflection of her face that she saw. It was the space around her, the room as it was, the room as it had been. The faint outline of the chair once pushed back in a different way, the suggestion of footsteps that had worn a path in the rug. She had stepped into something larger than memory, into inheritance, not of things, but of quiet, of understanding passed down not in stories, but in pauses, the kind her aunt used to hold without effort, the kind that had once made her uncomfortable. Now, it was where she felt most herself. She closed the lid slowly, reverently. There was no sound, no click, just the soft finality of wood meeting wood. The box had been opened twice, once in wonder, once in gratitude. It would not need to be opened again. It had done its work, not by revealing anything, but by staying, remaining, offering space when nothing else could. She sat there a little longer, her hands resting now on her lap, her eyes unfocused. She wasn't thinking. She wasn't remembering. She was only being. And in that being the silence returned, not as an end, but as a beginning reshaped, a melody not played, but lived. She rose from the vanity and crossed the room, her footsteps unhurried, her breath steady. At the door she paused, not from uncertainty, but from completion. Some spaces asked to be left quietly, and this was one of them. She left the door ajar, just as her aunt had often done, a gesture that said, "I was here. I will return, even if only in memory." The hallway greeted her gently, the light from the window tracing her shadow along the floor. She followed it, not as a guide, but as a companion. Shadows had become something different now, not the absence of light, but the shape of its passage. She passed the staircase, past the small bookshelf with the uneven spines, and returned to the kitchen, where the kettle still held the warmth of the morning. She sat once more by the window, this time without tea, without a book, without any object between her and the moment. The garden had shifted slightly, colors deepening, shadows stretching. The wind carried a different texture now, cooler, more deliberate. She watched a single leaf loosen from its branch and fall, not in a hurry, but in a slow, circular dance. It touched the ground without a sound, and in that soundless descent, she understood something else, that even letting go has its own kind of grace. The house didn't need her to stay. It never had. It had only asked her to listen, and now, having listened fully, she was free to leave, not in departure but in continuation, to carry the stillness with her, to keep the music even when the box remained behind. She stood again, slowly, feeling the familiar weight of presence in her chest, not heavy, but full of mornings spent in silence, of rooms that whispered in the dust, of pages turned without reading, of footsteps taken without direction. She opened the back door, letting the cool air brush against her cheeks, and stepped outside, barefoot, onto the earth that had waited with the same patience as the house. Each blade of grass pressed gently against her soles. Each breath of wind moved past her without resistance. She looked back once, not out of doubt, but in acknowledgement. The house stood as it always had, still, quiet, whole. She smiled, not a gesture of happiness, but of understanding. And then she walked forward, not toward an ending, but into the kind of silence that lives wherever something has been truly heard. She didn't walk far, just to the edge of the garden, where the path met the line of trees that had always bordered the house like quiet guardians. The air smelled of bark and earth and the faint sweetness of something blooming out of season. She stood there for a while, not moving, not planning the next step. The world beyond the trees stretched open, undefined, yet she felt no pressure to step into it. The house behind her didn't pull her back. It had no demands. It had given her what it could, and now it rested, like a page turned without force. She lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the grass, the soil cool beneath her, the light above dappling through branches that swayed with the gentlest motion. Her hands lay loosely in her lap, palms open. She watched as an insect crawled across a fallen petal, oblivious to her presence. The moment was so still, so unspoken, that it felt sacred in its ordinariness. This, she thought, is what it meant to be in rhythm with something larger than thought. She didn't need to name it. She didn't need to record it. Some truths, like silence, grow clearer the longer they are left untouched. A breeze moved through the trees, not strong but steady, and for a moment it sounded like pages turning in a book no one was holding. The kind of book found years later, with notes in the margins and pressed flowers between its pages. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to lean in more deeply. The stillness inside her had grown soft and wide, like a room with no walls. In that space, the music box played, not with notes or tune, but with everything she had come to understand. The unspoken love of a woman who kept silence like an heirloom. The weightless presence of a house that held time without trapping it. The shape of memory that needed no photograph. It was all there, in the hush between heartbeats, in the space she had made by listening. And though there was no melody, she heard it all, the life before her, the life behind her, meeting in the quiet that no longer asked her to choose between them. When she opened her eyes again, the sun had dipped lower, casting a warm hush across the tops of the grass. The light had turned amber, stretched longer, as if it too was lingering for one last moment before slipping away. She rose slowly, brushing bits of leaf and earth from her skirt, and stood in the quiet like one does at the end of a conversation that didn't need words. There was nothing to gather, nothing to say goodbye to. Only the soft understanding that something had finished and something else would now begin. She turned once more toward the house, not to return, but to offer it a parting glance, the kind reserved not for places but for teachers. She walked back along the path, not hurried, not slow, just present. The house grew smaller behind her, the trees closing gently around her shoulders like arms that don't hold but accompany. She didn't know exactly where she was going, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel like a loss. It felt like openness, like the space between notes that gives a melody its shape. In her chest, there was no ache, no longing, only the kind of fullness that comes after something has been received completely. She carried no object with her, not the music box, not a letter, not even the book with the pressed flowers. And yet, she carried everything. The silence went with her, not as a shadow, but as a presence. It moved in her breath, in the rhythm of her feet, in the way she no longer needed to ask what came next. She had heard something most people never stop long enough to notice. She had sat inside a room and listened until the walls spoke, not in voices, but in quiet. And she had understood. That was all. Not solved, not discovered, just understood. As she disappeared into the tree line, the wind shifted once more behind her, sweeping gently through the open windows of the house. And somewhere inside, though no one remained to hear it, the music box played again. Not with sound, but with memory. Not with notes, but with silence. And the house, patient and still, listened once more.